get started because we're all looking forward to hearing Professor Ortega's talk. So I'll give a brief introduction to her visit to us. I'd like to first thank everyone on behalf of the Institute of World Languages for being here this afternoon for the first of the Spring Speaker Series sponsored by the IWL. Our guest today is Lourdes Ortega, Professor of Linguistics at Georgetown University. Professor Ortega is a highly accomplished scholar and teacher and an undisputed authority in the field of second language acquisition. She holds degrees from the University of Cádiz in Spain, Cambridge University, and the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She's earned numerous research awards and fellowships, has held visiting appointments at at institutions in various countries. She serves or has served on the editorial boards of many top-tier academic journals. The second edition of her book, Understanding Second Language Acquisition, is forthcoming in 2016. Professor Ortega has edited, as well as co-edited, volumes of collected essays, published articles in journals and chapters in books on various aspects of the field. She's contributed to handbooks and encyclopedias and presented her work, for time's sake, let's just say all over the world. Of her many, many articles, two of the most recent ones offer a glimpse into the emphasis of her scholarship. In 2014, she published The Cognitive Social Gap, Multiple Understandings, Hopeful Commensurabilities, and Bridging the Gap, Cognitive and Social Approaches to Research in Second Language Learning and Teaching. Titles that reveal her interest not only in language teaching practices, but also in turning the spotlight onto the very methodologies of and reasons for researching second language acquisition. She's published on measuring oral proficiency, approaches to effective teaching and research practices, writing to learn, and uses of technology, to name a few among a broad array of other topics. But rather than continue here with an exhaustive list of Professor Ortega's publications and presentations, I encourage you to consult her CV at the Georgetown University website to really comprehend her dedication and her great contribution to the field. Today, Professor Ortega is here to present her talk titled Best Practices in Error Correction in Foreign Language Classrooms, in which she will address complexities in this important part of all of our work, and propose tentative best practices relating to why, whether, how, when, and what to correct in our students' foreign language learning. So without further delay, let's now give a warm welcome to Professor Lourdes Ortega.
Thank you very much for that introduction. That made me blush. Basically, what that all means is that I work nonstop, 24 hours a day. And I've been doing that for a long time now. But it's my passion for second language learning in classrooms and outside of classrooms that keeps me going. So I wanted to thank my hosts here for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to come for the first time to Charlottesville. I arrived in the train yesterday in the afternoon, and I've been meeting with many colleagues, listening to their ideas, their questions, and admiring the dedication of the Institute to language education and to language learning. And here are my languages, the ones that I can claim. English, German, Greek, and Spanish, of course. Spanish is my native language. And a little bit of Hawaiian that I studied for 3 semesters at the University of Hawaii while I was a doctoral student there. So I've tried to rely on examples of English in a good part of the examples, because I think that everyone will be able to follow those examples. But I've tried to include some examples in other languages, and I apologize if anyone in the room will not see an example in their language, probably many of you. But all right, and I'm very happy to share the PowerPoint, so I can give it to Miao Feng, and then she can share it with you, so you don't have to struggle with notes or wonder about the references. So what am I going to do today? I would like to talk about error correction. It's a central part of every teacher's job. It's also something that most students expect. And it creates a lot of tensions professionally, because we are in a world where teaching English or Spanish or any other language means teaching communicatively. And so the goals of communication, intercultural learning, task-based language teaching, those goals sometimes don't seem to obviously have a place for accuracy, right? So then, do we correct errors? How do we deal with accuracy in a world where communication seems to be the center of pedagogy? It's also a worry for many teachers that error correction can lead to great doubts about whether we're killing our students' motivation while we correct them. And also it creates a huge amount of demands on our time, especially error correction on writing and written assignments. And I know many teachers who keep wondering whether they are overdoing it or underdoing it. Teachers who keep wondering whether it really works, and how would they know if it works or if it doesn't. So what is the research evidence, and what does it tell us? That's sort of my role today in speaking to you. And I'm going to tell you that there are as many arguments for pessimism as there are for optimism. Yeah? So there are very famous studies from the late 90s and the 2000s questioning whether error correction works at all in language classrooms, oral error correction in writing. And there are also many who believe that the studies show reasons for optimism. And you will see here that some of those studies are more recent, so they've been better conducted, they have achieved more experimental control, and they tend to show benefits and gains for the error correction regimes that they study. But the dispute goes on, and generally I would like to tell you that the sum of the research is inconclusive at this point. And not only about the overall effectiveness, which some scholars continue to doubt, but also about many of the details. Yeah? So my bottom line, which I am going to give you today, is based on research, but it also is based on a lot of interpretation of that research through my own lenses. Error correction can be a daunting professional conundrum. Many teachers really suffer through this part of their teaching because they have so many doubts and because it creates so much burden for them in terms of time. But it can also be a rich journey of professional self-discovery. So that's what I'm going to try to do today, to convince you that it actually is a really good thing to struggle over the conundrum of error correction. And I'm going to offer 3 best practices. One is to be selective about what you correct and to try to vary how you correct. The other one is to plan students' use of error correction ahead of time. And the third one is to put affect and emotions first. So let me move on directly into the first and most important thing. Why do we correct? Why do you correct? Have you thought about it? What is the value of grammatical accuracy for you as teachers and for your students? That's the first real question that we need to ask. And we need to ask all teachers to clarify their beliefs. Do you feel that you wouldn't want to correct at all? Raise your hand if anyone feels like that. It's a bit threatening in this environment to say, I am one of those. But there are teachers who do not want to correct, and they really are uncomfortable exercising error correction in their classrooms, especially face-to-face, orally. Or are you going to be the kind of teacher who says, I correct selectively? Or the kind of teacher who says, I correct everything? Raise your hand if you're one of those compulsive error correction teachers. They cannot stop themselves in writing, especially because it's less face-threatening and easier to implement. And so they spend hours and hours and hours grading and correcting their students' papers because they can't stop themselves. They will correct as much as they can, materially and spiritually. Or do you have preferred strategies? Are you the kind of teacher who feels like this way of doing it is how I feel comfortable doing it, that's how I do it the most? Yeah? Or are you just wondering what is gained when I do it? And how do you know what's gained? Have you ever stopped to look for the signs, the evidence in your own teaching, in your students' behaviors, in your students' changes over time? A semester is very short, but maybe you have other students who you keep having in classes later on. Have you looked for how to gauge whether what you're doing seems to be working or not? So I think that teachers have to have a stance on error correction. Yeah? That's what I would encourage you to do. Reflectively clarify your values and beliefs about error, accuracy, and correction. And think, how do they match? How do they motivate my current practices when I correct? So what we think and what we value is one thing, and also how we do it or what we do in practice is a different thing. So what's the match there as well? And one of the whys for correcting that I hear the most from teachers is that students want and expect to be corrected by their teachers, right? Is that true? For the most part. So here's a study that I did in 2005 with Spanish foreign language learners. And yes, there are students who are really, really wanting to have the error correction. These are very accuracy-oriented learners. For example, this one says, I always go back and think about the errors that I make, almost to the point where I don't want to say anything if it's going to be wrong. Although I think I've gotten past that problem, you know. Otherwise, you can't say anything. But yeah, I do want it to be perfect. I'm always trying to get it 100% perfect. I'm never happy with just sort of this, right? This kind of student welcomes error correction comprehensively and all the time, right? But there are many students also in the same classes for the same kinds of programs and contexts who are very communication oriented. For example, this other student from the same group, in the same study, says, unless you're a native speaker, you're not going to be able to speak perfect. I mean, we're still English speakers, you know? Because, I mean, you want to say it correctly, but I don't think you need to say it always correctly. I think you can always get away with it or get along the idea in a basic way. Yeah, you want to say it correctly, but it'll come through repetition and going over more and more, or being among people that speak correctly all the time. Yeah? So not so much it will come from my teacher correcting every error, but it'll come with time and with experience and contact. Very different attitudes. And what about heritage language speakers, if you have them in your classes for whatever languages you teach? They may express different needs and different wants, and they relate to their attitudes towards error correction. In this study, for example, Antonio, a heritage language student, said, heritage language students know how to speak, but not how to write. So please do not correct me in my speech, but please give me a lot of correction in my writing. Yeah? Or Ophelia said, I use colloquial. I want to make it more standard. Now I'm aware that I was poor in Spanish and need to improve it. I know that I'm limited to some parts of my language. Or Cesar says, I had no notion of writing. I made lots of mistakes as far as writing goes. I might be at a higher level as far as conversation and speaking. Again, a very differentiated view of what's needed in terms of accuracy and error correction in writing versus speaking. Manuel says, my writing is not professional. And Jorge says, Spanish is in our brain. We just have to polish it. So things like questionnaires and free writing, asking your students to free write or to answer questionnaires from you about what they think about error correction, what they want from it, what they want you to do, apparently. It's important, it's useful. We can do it with every class. We can do it in the target language, or we can do it in English, depending on the level of the students. But here's a teacher's experience, a Spanish teacher. I'm going to try my glasses on and see if they help or not with this. Maybe they do. This teacher, a male teacher of Spanish, says, I do not remember exactly when it was, but at some point during my first 2 semesters teaching first-year Spanish, I realized that it was neither necessary nor beneficial or practical to correct every single error in my students' compositions. This conclusion occurred to me nearly simultaneously in 2 places, at home during long hours of meticulous grading and editing, and in one of the 2 methods classes I took that year. Nevertheless, before rashly altering my correction policies and practices, I decided to inquire as to how my classes would feel about me not correcting every single error in their papers. It turned out that I forgot to pose the question in one of my 2 classes. But the group that I did question responded overwhelmingly in opposition to my proposal. Upon returning the next stack of compositions, I then informed both classes that I only made grammatical markings on a select set of errors that I wanted them to focus on in their writing. Contrary to their prior reactions, both classes showed tremendous approval, despite what had previously been expressed to me. Okay? So you ask, you get an answer, and that is not the full story either, right? So here it goes. Ask your students. Find out how they feel about error correction. Don't assume that you know. Ask them. Also, don't assume that they all feel the same just because they're the same kind of group, the same kind of level, the same kind of student that you've always experienced. And don't assume that what they say they want and what they really want is the same thing. Yeah? So we really have to do the homework of asking them, sorting through what they say, but also exercising our own professional authority. They may tell us what they want and why. We still have arguments to tell them what we want and why, and it can be negotiated transparently. Yeah? Okay, so that was a little bit about the why. Let's move on onto the many hows of error correction. And here the studies are many, and they have documented how it can be done and what the relative success is. In writing, for example, we can actually simply mark where every error is, right? Or we can do direct error correction and just provide every correct rendition to everything that we see that is an error. Or we could indicate the location and the type of error and leave it up to the students to figure out the rest. And in this sense, many teachers like using an error code. How many of you use an error code for your languages? Ooh, see, it's very popular. In oral, we have recasts. How many of you know what recasts are? Okay, so I have a lot of examples here, and actually with many languages. In this study in '98 that I did with Michael Long and Shunji Inagaki, we did a Spanish study and a Japanese study, run the 2 parallel. We were providing recasts to students. For example, for the Spanish example, we had some pieces that we wanted to move around in a sort of game. And so the piece was La Guitarra, and then the student logically would say something like, so they had many pieces to distribute among people, right? So with the guitarra in hand, the student would say something like, Pedro tiene la guitarra, so that I would place the guitar with Pedro, right? And then the researcher, that was me at that time, would recast saying, la guitarra la tiene Pedro, huh? Right? So I would use non-canonical word order because the guitarra was the topic and it had been topicalized. We were talking about guitarra versus book versus other things. And so, la guitarra la tiene Pedro. Okay, and then I would place the guitar with Pedro. Yeah? So the student would always use the canonical word order. I would recast it into the non-canonical word order with the clitic that Spanish requires for that, which is pretty difficult and pretty advanced. Yeah? In Japanese, anyone speaks Japanese here? Great. So in Japanese, it was a different structure. They had some pieces that they had to choose from, and we were playing with the shapes and the colors, and it was just to produce structures that in Japanese require the order for the shape and for the color, the adjectives in a particular order. So here, I won't read it out loud, but I can do the English, I guess. The participant would say something like, a large red piece of paper. And then the tape recorder would say, yes. And then the researcher would recast saying, red, large paper. So it was the opposite order that would have been required for Japanese. Yeah? So again, we let the students say it their own way, and we turn it back, same meaning, what they just said, but we say it the right way, and that's a recast. Yeah? And here's a recast in French. How many of you do French? So you can read the example. The first man is, it's rude, but he is fat, and the fat is the wrong gender. And so the teacher says, he's fat with the right gender, right? And then the student says, yes, he's fat with the right gender, thank goodness in that case, right? That doesn't happen all the time, but in this case it was successful. And this one again is Japanese, very conversational, yeah? How about marriage? Well, Rachel, can you do this? Yes. Well, if I get married, I want to travel. If you get married, I will travel. And if I get married, I will travel. And then the student says, yes, I will travel. So again, correcting after the teacher offers the right rendition. Yeah? But there is another way to do it, which is prompting, insisting that the student will tell you what they want right before you offer the right answer. Yeah? And some scholars think that this is a much better approach, because you're telling the student, no, you know better, tell me, I won't give you the answer yet, tell me first, make an effort. Yeah? So here is, for example, the teacher says, what does the website contain? And one student says, this website is contain useful things. And then the teacher just repeats the error without anything else. It's just like, is contain? And so all the students, the rest of the students in the class actually say, this website contains useful things. And so the student who initiated the error says, oh yes, it contains things that you can buy and sell. Okay? This is a really successful exchange. It's not always that way, but prompts are supposed to be more work for the student, and therefore perhaps more engaged and more successful at long-term learning. We can have clarification requests. The classical example is like they say something and you're like, what? I don't understand. Or you pretend you don't understand. And that forces them to say it again, say it better perhaps. Metalinguistic explanations are very common also. I came from Korea. Where are you from? I came from Korea. And so the teacher says, if you're originally from Korea, you should use present tense when you refer to it. So it's just like a statement of the rule, right? Especially when the rule has been already learned many times. It's just a good way to remind the student, hey, you know that rule, why don't you use it? Yeah? And there are many ways to combine these things. For example, here is a clarification request, but it's a little bit more involved, right? So what Mark put in the glass? What Mark put? Sorry. So the teacher repeats the string that is at fault, and then feigns non-comprehension. Sorry? And then the student says, what is Mark put in the glass? Not correct yet, but a little bit better than what Mark put, because there is something there. It's not the right does or did, but at least it's something. So it's a bit more towards the target. Yeah? Or here, it's a compound recast. This is a very lovely exchange. So the student says, describing an experiment, I think that the worm will go under the soil. What did you think was going to happen? I think that the worm will go under the soil. And the teacher says, I think that the worm will go under the soil. So repeat the error. Prompt. Just repeat it, but question it and let the student do something. The poor student, his name was Jose in this study, Jose just can't do anything about it. He knows the teacher was something, he can't give the teacher the right rendition. So finally the teacher says, I thought that the worm would go under the soil, and offers the recast, the right version. And so the student, very clever student, knows that this is a correction, that he's supposed to repeat it, and he repeats it back. Yeah? Now, has this student now learned to do it forever from now on? That's the doubt. So while it's always better to let the student come up with a solution, while it's always better to force or hope or train your students to finally say it right or repeat it right, none of it ensures that they get it forever after that, right? So the here and now can go really well, but does it carry over? Or is it just that we had a great exchange, but then nothing else happens? Conversely, it may be that they seem to be completely oblivious to what you're correcting. But maybe inside their heads, they are actually doing something that they're not exteriorizing or telling you about. That's why it's so complicated to do studies on error correction and to prove what's good or what's not good, because you can't be in the head of the person, and because what comes publicly in the record of the discourse may or may not carry over time. Okay, I love this one, gestures, shorthand gestures. How many of you use them in class to correct? Probably many of you, right? So in this case, the teacher says, what would happen if I dropped my purse, Bahman? And Bahman says, it will probably, and then the teacher just does this. And this, they had already been in cahoots. This, if I do this, it means, think of your tense, something is not right. Try it again. And just with that, then Bahman says, it would break something inside. Right? And there is other proposals, like you just go little by little, you give as little support to find the solution as you can, and when the student doesn't react, you push a little bit harder. Okay, what's wrong there? I don't know. Well, what's wrong right here, right here? Think of that. I don't know. Well, think of the article rules that we studied last week. I don't know. Finally, you say, okay, it's the cat, not cat. So you go little by little, and you only go all the way to offer the solution, to do the recast, basically, until you know that there is no other way to get that done, that the student doesn't have the knowledge to go all the way to the right solution. Yeah? But you don't rush into immediately go for the recast, or forever go and stay with the prompt. You know, that's not right, that's not right. Well, if they can't do anything, you have to do something about it, right? Okay. The how for the research evidence is very, very messy and all over the place. And a lot of my colleagues, depending on how they do their research, will come here and tell you recasts are the best thing in the world, or they'll tell you prompts are the best thing in the world. I did the first recast study in '98, but I'm not married to anything because I know all the research very well, and I can see that there is no real agreement or consensus yet. So here are some things that we do know from all the accumulated research. First, teachers love recasts. So probably most of you are recasters, whether you know it or not. It's a very natural conversational thing to do in the classroom, and a lot of teachers love recasts. And study after study, regardless of the context, shows most teachers doing about 60% of all their corrections in the form of recasts. That's a lot, right? However, some teachers, and this is the minority teachers, when the studies look at individual data, sometimes they see a teacher who is doing sort of like 30-30-30 between recasts, prompts, and metalinguistic explanations, which are the three main types. Yeah? So those teachers who vary and they don't seem to have a one overwhelmingly preferred way to do it, they seem to be the more experienced or the more sort of measured and balanced and effective. They get a lot of good responses out of their corrections from their students, at least in the immediate discourse. Yeah? So they seem to be knowing when is better to give the solution right there, recast, when is better to push the learner and say, come on, give it to me, you know it, you can do better. And when they're saying, well, I need an explanation for them, or this student needs an explanation from me. Yeah? And the other thing that we know is that context matters a lot in what kind of treatment errors get. So depending on the context, recasts these reformulations, let me give you the correct thing of what you just said. Yeah? These recasts can be delivered very explicitly and pedagogically in a way that it's clear to the student and to the teacher that they're right there correcting me. Or they can be delivered very conversationally to the point that neither the researcher who's listening to the recordings, probably neither the teacher nor the student, no one knows whether there was an intention to correct here, or is it just that in the conversation, if a student tells me, I go to the supermarket yesterday and I buy great things, I'm not going to respond just like that. So I could probably say, oh, you went to the supermarket and bought great things? That's wonderful, right? Did I intend to correct? It's very difficult to know from the conversation. Did the student think, my teacher is correcting me? Also very difficult to know. So sometimes the recasts are delivered super, super incidentally. But other times they're delivered with a complete intonation and stress and an intention to correct that is very obvious to all participants. And very funny, quite a few studies now have captured these. When the teachers start doing things that in that context most teachers and even themselves before never did, that's what the students seem to be picking up more on. So when a teacher was always correcting with prompts, you give me, you give me, you give me, suddenly starts doing recasts, those recasts get a better response. More repetition, more like, oh yeah, let me repeat it after you. Yeah? And the other way around. When a teacher is very incidental, lots of recasts, no overt correction, and they start doing more of a prompt, that's when the students start getting interested and perked about error correction. So there's something about, you get used to your teacher's style, you get used to how they're correcting, and you start not noticing or not being super engaged with it. When the teacher starts varying, then that's like, oh, I like this. Finally, my teacher is explicitly correcting me sometimes during oral interaction. Or finally, we're having a conversation, right? And yes, I can repeat what they say. Yeah. Okay, but these patterns, I think they're very well established by the research now, but they don't help that much for teachers to know what to do. Yeah. So I would say, know yourself. That's a very important precept. What kind of teacher are you in terms of error correction? How do you do it? How do you like doing it normally? Can you vary more? Have you tried out new things, or are you just always sort of doing it the same preferred way? And yes, how do you do it? And then, do you do it like everyone else around you? Is this typical in your context? Is this an ethos in the context that everyone who's working with you in the same program tends to go about research, about error correction in the same way? Is it something that the students are also clued into expecting, and so maybe they need a little bit of a push out of that, right? How effective is it, though? This is like the biggest question, right? Because we can vary, we can do more recasts, we can do more prompts, but in the end, how effective is it? As I said before, as many arguments for pessimism as for optimism, and the studies are many, many, many. I think probably motivation and error correction are the three biggest topics in second language acquisition. And there are heaps and heaps of studies in all three topics. So what do students do with our error correction? Well, they keep erring. Even when we give them the right form in the recast, right? So here's the student. Does he, the hand, on the hand, what? And so the interlocutor, the teacher says, what is he carrying? Is this what you're asking? What is he carrying? And then the student says, yeah, what he is carrying? So, or here, and in the kitchen on the shelf. I have it on the shelf. This is also a recast, right? And the student says, in the shelf, yes, okay, and moves the piece. So the article was corrected, and now it's right in the student's rendition, but the preposition which was right now is wrong, right? And the pronunciation of chef, shelf, is also right. So some things get fixed, some things go sideways, and it's so difficult, right? It's balance, it's a balancing act. So when we correct on chef, the interlocutor is correcting the article and the pronunciation, and that's already a double correction. Whether we know it or not, we're doing that. And then the student picks up on the two corrections, but whoop, the preposition goes off, right? Which is very normal for English. English prepositions are terrible. English articles are terrible, and the pronunciation is just a matter of whether they know the word or not. Or they seemingly ignore our correction. Where I can find information about driver's license, where can I find information about a driver's license? So many corrections there. I only highlighted the green, but there are 3 corrections there, right? And the student, what does the student do? Yes, that's what I meant. You got me right. So that's a classic thing that happens with recasts. We give them, they're beautiful, but if they are multiple corrections at once, they are likely to overload the interlocutor, the student. And so it shouldn't be surprising that the student just says, yes, you got me. That was exactly what I wanted to say. How are they using that for learning? Well, very difficult to say. Yeah? And the same thing here, but it's like with data from afterwards, where they say when you replay it on the recorder. So it has mixed colors. It has mixed colors. Mixed colors, right? So the person manages to confirm the keywords with that, and tiptoeing around the grammar. So there is no grammar there that needs to be said, right? And then later, when interviewed after listening to the recording, to the exchange, the student says, I was thinking nothing. She just repeated what I said. And indeed she did, but she did with a lot of extra grammar there, right? And this one is also a general type of attitude, for the communication-oriented students. Let me try to read it just by getting really close to the screen. Since I heard your explanation of the present tense, I think it's reasonable, but I won't write on like this kind cause it's sort of complicated for me. So you're explaining me about the tenses that I didn't write well in my essay. I find that reasonable as an explanation, but I'm not going to write like that because it's just too difficult for me, right? Too complicated. And then she says, everybody can understand that simple past, So I never really concern about those things. If I say something you don't understand, maybe I will really take a look at those sentences I make. So it's like, don't bother me with error correction of things that you really, truly know what I mean. If you know what I mean, don't bother me about it. If you don't know what I mean, then sincerely ask me, what? Pardon? But don't feign non-understanding. Yeah? That's the attitude of this student. And there are, just this last year, students, studies documenting how the students, when they find the corrections really difficult, they misinterpret, they get it wrong, they cannot use it. So it's very important to consider that. And sometimes they're very good students and they comply, but still, inside their hearts, they're saying, and why? I don't agree, but I'll do it because it's my teacher. So this one, the teacher said, you need an article here. It's an extra article in this essay. So the student, now it's not, okay, it's booting somehow. Okay, good. So the student revised very nicely with the extra article in it in the next draft. But when interviewed, here's what the student says. Yeah, this one I don't quite understand because I'm going to speak about buying behavior of a common buyer, not particular buyers. Why do I have to say the buyer or the buying behavior from buyers? Not particular buyers. And I think that we don't need to have article here. But when I get comments from my teacher, I try to put one article. So I'm still not convinced, but I'll comply. I'm a good student. Yeah? But many studies, not as many, but some studies do capture also that the error correction is used with understanding. So here, for example, the student says tricky. and the interlocutor 3. So this is a prompt, 3. And then the student immediately says keys. Right? And later on, when interviewed, the student says, after key again, I make a little effort to say keys because you have 3. I was thinking, try a little better English. So this is a lovely capturing that, yeah, students try hard and sometimes they can do a lot with our corrections. But this is a very simple correction, one thing, right? So try to experiment. Explore alternative hows for error correction within reason. I never recommend teachers to experiment widely, but within reason, try to experiment different hows. And the devil in the end is in the detail for error correction. So it's the variety that you use, what the context is doing for you or not, and the here and now of how we deliver the error correction, who the student in front of us is, what the error is, etc. And again, that's why the studies don't show clear findings, because it's a highly, highly complex issue. And so it's very difficult to design studies that can capture all of these things at once. The what and the how much. The what of error correction. Okay, here's an important thing. Those of you who are linguists will understand this a lot better than those of you who are not. But diagnosing an error, so saying, what happened there? Why did they make that error? Because that's very important for knowing how to correct it. It's very, very difficult. So here's a sentence. Again, it's an essay. There are so many Taiwan people live around the lake. There are a few things wrong, but what's the main thing that we may think, oh, this writer needs a correction here so that they don't drop the who, right? So there are so many Taiwanese people who live around the lake, or there are many Taiwanese people who live around the lake. That's like the normal way in which a teacher probably would try to recast or correct in writing this sentence so that it looks more grammatical. It turns out that that's not at all what's happening there. And what's happening is that this writer comes from a language background that is structured around topic comment, whereas English is structured around subject-verb, right? And so this person is sort of moving along from structuring everything always topic, comment, to beginning to do it more subject, object, or subject, verb, object, as in English, yeah? So it's very complex, and only studies can uncover this. But this person started by doing everything like, many Taiwan people, that's the topic, they live around the lake. And you will see this in essays too. As for this thing does this, right? It's like establishing the topic, repeating the subject perhaps, and then going on with the thing, right? Very common in essays. So the second, more improved version is what this person did, which is, I'm not gonna do many Taiwanese people, they live around the lake, but I'm gonna do there are. And that allows me to topicalize or to introduce the topic again. It's like a little holder. I feel more comfortable that way because in my language, I love starting with, let's take the topic and then let's do the rest of the work, right? So now it's a better improved version that we also find oftentimes in essays. Sometimes it doesn't even lead to anything ungrammatical. So we see a lot of there is and there are and there is and there are to introduce things, and we don't notice that that's a little bit too much for English perhaps. We don't do every other sentence with there is or there are. And then the person goes to this rendition where what they're doing is, or they should be doing, who live around the world, around the lake. Yeah. So if we're good and we give them the who, and if they start doing more relative clauses, they're going to try to do it this way. And again, this is not going to be very ungrammatical at all. But it's again unnatural to say in English, there are many Taiwanese people who live around the lake. Because what does English prefer? Not even. Subject, verb, argument. English prefers clarity and directness. Nothing like As for the Taiwanese people, let me tell you, well, many of them live around the lake. No, it's like Taiwanese people do this, period. Right? When you get to that high level of writing and linguistic proficiency, that's when you get this succinct, precise language that we all want from especially academic writing, research writing. Right? So you're like being less verbose because you're just trying not to hold on too much to the ways of structuring information in your first language when there is this difference. But the teacher who corrected with the who was actually hitting on the third stage in the development of this sort of like way of writing and using grammar, right? And totally missed the fact that they could have also said, you know what, strike there are, and just say, many Taiwanese people live around the lake, and you're perfect. An English person will be happy with that. Right? So they introduced the who, which is a lot more complicated. Right? So it's very, very difficult to diagnose issues. That comes from a really old classic SLA study. And by the way, the other way around is also true. So languages that organize things around topics, and that's Korean, Chinese, Japanese. When you're an English speaker who likes subject, verb, predicate, and you're learning that language, you get a hell of a time trying to do it the other way around, right? And so, for example, in this study with Korean, very few students, only the very advanced students, would use this, I don't know how to pronounce it. Any Korean speakers? Nun. Right, very good. This is how you have to say it in Korean to sound natural. As for the elephant, its nose is long. Or as for elephants, all elephants, right? All elephants, their noses are long, right? But you have to do it topicalizing nicely. And an English speaker trying to do Korean will, in the beginning, try to just say, well, elephants' noses are long, yeah? And that would be not the right information structure, yeah? And the same happens also with Chinese. We have a study on that too. Okay, so it's very difficult to diagnose errors, but now, how much should we be correcting? Here's a strip of a little story, right? Can you see what's happening? The man, very desperate. Look, this is very sexist, actually, this story, entire story. But in those times, textbooks could get away with things like this. So the man looks at the kitchen, desperate, you know, how many dirty plates. The woman is just cosmetics and getting prettier. So the man goes down the stairs, goes to the supermarket, buys all kinds of things to clean, comes back home and tells the wife, go and clean that kitchen. So she complies, she goes, she starts cleaning, but suddenly she discovers that one of the pans can be a beautiful mirror. And she starts looking at herself in the mirror. And then she gets some other ideas, and she goes back to her old favorite way of killing time, cosmetics and getting prettier. Right? So I asked students to write out this story in whatever language they had. And here's a Spanish rendition of it. So many of you speak Spanish, but not so many. So I'll read a couple of lines so that you get a flavor for the language, for the grammar. La casa fue una desastre. Hubo platos en la cocina, periódicos estuvieron toda la casa. Mi esposa nunca limpia, nos casa, o se hace de compras. Fui al mercado y compré muchos productos de limpiar como Ajax, Clorox y Pine-Sol. Cuando yo regreso, yo grité, limpie esta casa ahora. Mi esposa comenzó a trabajar, pero no por más tiempo. Ella se miró en su reflexión y ahora ella cree que está la reina de la casa. Hubo productos de las estéticas y platos en la cocina. Estos días ella se mira su reflexión en el mirror todo el día. Me gusta más antes de yo decirle al limpiar. Lovely story, great writer. Absolutely, you know, the task is accomplished. The grammar is atrocious. But if we correct every error, and these are not all of them, we would be doing 12 lines, 30 errors. These are like main key errors that we could very easily correct. Yeah?
I guess you could look at like what they're doing wrong, like the general ones, like I guess gender. So if you maybe there's more about like 1 or 2, and then maybe they'll get the idea.
Perfect. So we could decide, let's be selective. Let's focus on gender and tell the student ahead of time, when you write this thing, I'm going to give you correction, but just on gender issues, right? Because if we only give gender issues correction, but the student thinks we are correcting everything like we normally do, that would be very misleading as well, right? So important, very, very important, is to establish an explicit understanding with your students of what you're going to do with correction and how you're going to do it and why. So I totally agree. I would say, well, let's pick one thing. Let's say gender, right? And I will correct you on that. But if we do 12 lines, 30 errors corrected, that's a complete overload and very discouraging, yeah? And a lot of time for us. And not only that, but it seems like certain areas of language are much more amenable to correction than others. So for example, this is a study when they corrected the simple past and the definite article, so 2 different structures there. So ED, you know, like I jumped and I talked and I walked and I wanted, and the definite article, the car versus car. We've had a lot of examples of that in the data. The students improved in those 2 areas. But the same students, the same essays, a third area of correction was prepositions in English. No change, right? Same way to correct, same intensity of correction, same length. So this was, the study was every 2 weeks a different writing, and they would receive correction. And the blue group never received any correction, so they stayed the same over the 12 weeks. The green group received just correction in writing, and on average, they also didn't improve at all, although they improved a little bit more in the structures that are more amenable if you unpack it. And the red was they received written feedback and they met with the teacher for conferencing. You know, did you understand my feedback? Do you have any questions? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but a little bit of a follow-up face-to-face. They were the ones that didn't go really every time I learned more, but they went very kind of like up and down, but in the end they were doing much better. Yeah? But still, the benefits that were observed for that group were in 2 of the 3 structures. So not every area of language, maybe gender will be one that is amenable to improvement fast, yeah? But maybe some other areas are not. And if we are correcting the Taiwanese who live in the lake, we may be hitting on the wrong thing, so to speak, for the student who want to actually keep improving faster. And if we were telling them, get rid of the there is all the time, that's not needed in English. Just say, the Taiwanese live around the lake. That's what's going to make them get it and get it faster. So it's very, very complex and difficult. Yeah? So my best bet that I can offer is that you have to be selective in what you correct. An overwhelming correction of everything is going to overload. Orally, you saw all those examples with more than 1 error. It just a bit of an overload, and in writing as well. But how do we select? That's the big question. So task-tailored kinds of selections is a good idea. So take the grammar focus from the activity or the assignment and tell students ahead of time what you're going to select to correct. The syllabus tailored, sometimes we have a textbook, and 1 week is subjunctive, the next week is articles, the next week is prepositions. So it's fair to say, well, we are going to concentrate on that for our correction this week. Yeah? And instance tailor, something arises in the moment and you feel it's a teachable error right there for that student at that moment, you correct it. You're a good teacher, you have the instinct, you can make the decision. You shouldn't be afraid of doing that. And then class tailored, whenever you see something that is pervasive and it keeps coming up across students, at some point it's worth stopping, preparing a mini lesson, a little bit of practice, and doing something later on in another session and saying, you know what, I've been hearing a lot of X lately from everyone. Let's do this little mini grammar lesson. Yeah? So you can do it in many different ways, how to select, and that is related to the when. So I won't repeat it, but you can do it on the fly. You can do it after the facts. You can do it depending on the activity or assignment. You can choose when to do it differently. And you can do it prospectively. Yeah? So ahead of time, telling them, we're concentrating for accuracy on this week or these 2 weeks. Note that I won't correct all your errors, but I'm going to focus on this or that for this reason. Yeah? So they are on the same page with you. The most important thing is that a lot of learning is happening in their heads, but we don't know it. So for example here, I said freedom of thinking. I was not certain if it should be thinking or thought. I didn't come up with thought then, so I said freedom of thinking. Then I felt it might be wrong. Then the teacher said freedom of thought. So I thought, oh, I was wrong, just as I thought. So the students are listening to us. When they get their own questions, how do I say this way or that way? Yeah? They're often primed to then listen to how we're saying it as teachers, and they may be making mental notes. Right? This one is another example. Hearing it from other students being corrected. Tokiko's sentence was strange, but we could guess what she wanted to say. The teacher understood her. She said, and rephrased it in a correct or maybe in a better sentence. So I thought, that's how you say it. When I heard Tokiko, I thought it sounded wrong. But I didn't know how to express the idea better either. I was wondering how to say this. And the teacher said a sentence, and I thought, that's the right expression. But you've got to lead and harvest that into something real. You need to make your students use your feedback, not just mental notes, but use your feedback. So one-shot correction, one-glance feedback is not going to cut it. You have to plan and tell your students what they're supposed to do with your feedback. Yeah? So for example here, you could try to devote some class time to train them how to use your feedback, your correction. And so you could ask them, okay, tell me what you do with my corrections and how productive each of these strategies would be. Do you make a mental note? Do you write down the points and later classify them by type? Do you identify the points that you need to ask the teacher so that the teacher can explain later? Do you interrupt the teacher and ask for an explanation? Very few students would do that, but if we train them, if we have them think about that possibility and we give them the language to interrupt us politely, they may do it more. Yeah? I keep a notebook and refer back to my previous errors. That's the best students in the class. I consult the grammar book, or I incorporate the teacher's comments once I receive feedback. I keep revising and expanding, or many students, I do not do anything. It's great, my teacher corrects me. I'm sure that's going to work and help me, but I'm not doing anything with it. Right? There are lots of recommendations and inventions. This is like assign error logs so that they sort of keep track of their errors and they see how they are reduced over time, how they change. So maybe prepositions stay the same throughout the semester, but maybe articles improve a little bit and maybe past tense improves even more. Yeah? And other kinds of proposals, all of them metacognitive awareness. Yeah? So make your students use your feedback. Plan ahead what you will ask them to do with it afterwards and train them to be active users of error correction. So we've talked about the how, the why, the how, the what to correct and how much to correct it, the when to correct, and so what to do with it afterwards so that they use it actively. Yeah? Are there more complex issues still? One last one, the one that I want to finish with. It's never just about correcting language. Error correction is never just about language. Here's a teacher interview, a teacher telling the researcher, of course you wouldn't correct every mistake. The kids would just clam up. They totally lose confidence. What I do is focus on the structure that we're practicing. I don't ignore the other mistakes, but I don't draw attention to them. This is sort of like the philosophy of being selective. But the main reason why because it would be unbearable from the point of view of affect, emotion, anxiety, etc. Yeah, students clam up and they lose confidence at any age. That teacher was teaching high school students, adolescents, worst age possible, right? But in fact, all students, a graduate student said this once, and I'm citing her with permission, I did not think I was weak in my grammar, but when I got comments from a lot of professors about my grammar, I still feel I'm not legitimate academic writer. Their comment make me to think I'm not academically appropriate, but still need to go to ESL English classes to fix my grammar. I feel often I'm a long-term patient in a hospital to get a 10-year-long surgery. Because this person has been studying English forever and now is a graduate international student using English in daily life for all academic contexts, taking exams, doing research papers, and yet receiving a lot of error correction. And so I'm a 10-year-long surgery patient. Or it's also important to know that students have very sophisticated instincts about what we're doing to them, with them, for them. So this is a college EFL student in Japan writing to her teacher, says, I know my writing is better now than compared to the beginning of this year and the middle of it too, because you wrote many thank you and happy-like comments in my writing journal before now. After winter, you stopped praising too often. Then you gave some negative feedbacks, which means I should know the right academic way to write. So in the beginning, you were so soft on me, so happy faces all the time. Then you started getting a little bit more strict and serious. Now I know that I'm really doing better. I'm really maturing in my English. Now I know that you think I can be challenged. Yeah? So that's a huge amount of meta-awareness on the side of students. And this is another student. I'll skip this one. But I will read this one. It's always about identity, agency, and affect. For example, this ESL teacher journal explained to me, once I had a student who kept saying, I came from Korea. I tried to correct her grammar by saying, if you are originally from Korea, you should use present tense when you refer to it. Where are you from? I come from Korea. Yeah? She said, since I don't want to go back to Korea and identify myself with American, I'd rather say I came from Korea and wish to be an American one day. Nothing about the simple, the present and the past tense there. Nothing about the grammar. The whole issue is motivated by something very different, right? This one I'm going to skip, but I'm going to read you this one. So this is a graduate student in New Zealand doing an MBA, and she's over 30, so a mature person and everything. And she says, at the first time, I think that my writing is good because friends always say that it's good. But my teachers say that I have to have a lot of writing because it's not so good. And at the first time, I feel confident of my writing because I think that my grammar, my tense and my plural and verb use with plural, with singular is okay. But when the feedback come out, teacher doesn't look enough in that grammar. The grammar is not the most important thing for her. So she checked in the coherence, in introduction, in something else. And I haven't got good marks. So I think that I am poor in everything of writing. I think that my grammar is good, but I didn't get any comments that, oh, your grammar is good, but you still have to correct about something like this. But all the comments come that my writing is not so good. So I feel that everything is poor. I think that at least she should admire me some points. From that time, I discouraged a lot, and I feel don't like writing. So a whole lot of things going on here. A complete mismatch of the goals of the student and the goals of the teacher. The teacher is a writing teacher, is giving feedback on coherence, cohesion, organization, structure, the writing. The student is proud of her grammar. Why? For many reasons that we cannot get into. The grammar is, again, not so good, right? However, she is proud of it, and she sees nothing about it in the comments of the teacher. And that huge disencounter creates a lot of demotivation, a lot of serious problems.
Representation of semantics, I think she should admire me some points, and that's something I think is important, correcting semantics, because like it can be the difference of intending someone or just being
Right.
so confused because like there are words in Spanish.
Oh,
There are words in Spanish that could have more sexual connotations.
she should admire me some points. I think the teacher should admire her some points.
But I mean, like it's just admire, but like abuse.
Yeah, yeah. The point is that, you know, the sandwich technique, right? So we always should include praise, criticism, praise. Sandwich the criticism with some praise in between, right? This teacher forgot to do that, and that's not good. But there are other things that are even more important to me, because even with the praise, criticism, praise technique, there is a mismatch. This student is proud of her grammar. The teacher needs to discover that, because just the grammar won't tell that to the teacher, right? So it's like something special about this student. Her big pride is her accomplishment of grammar in English, and that the teacher cannot see unless they ask the student to tell them that. Plus then the teacher is ignoring the not so great grammar, so no correction at all on grammar, but lots of correction on the bigger picture of writing, because the teacher sees herself as a writing teacher, but the student sees herself as a near-field learner, an English as a foreign language learner who's improved in grammar a lot. So what we do in any language with our students, how proud they are of what? What do they think grammar is to them and in their role with the language? What do they think the assignment was about and what for? What do they think that we should be correcting or not? We need to negotiate all these things with them explicitly. Yeah? So do not underestimate error correction. It's not just about language. Identity, agency, and affect are at the front. So to conclude, I've said basically you have to have a stance and you have to ask your students. You have to know yourself and you should experiment within reason. You cannot underestimate error correction, and you must work with your students from your students' positions, their values, their expectations, their reading of what you're doing when you correct or you don't correct. Clarify that with them. You don't need to cave in and just do whatever the students want. You're the professional, you're the teacher, but you have to negotiate and communicate it well with them, or there can be a lot of disencounters in terms of your pedagogical goals and their learning. And so my bottom line, as I said in the beginning, is that there are 3 best practices that are safe and they are supported by the research. Be selective with what you correct and try to vary how you correct it. Plan your students' use of error correction explicitly and well, and put affect and emotions first. So, end of the talk. Not very many safe rules to go by. Are you frustrated? Are you baffled by the world of error correction? Some of you, the ones who do Spanish, will know Antonio Machado, who's a poet from Seville. And he has a very famous poem and little phrase that all Spanish speakers know, I think, most Spanish speakers. And I think it encapsulates really well what we can do as teachers with error correction for a professional journey of development. That's all we can hope for. Caminante no hay camino, se hace camino al andar. Yeah? Wanderer, there is no road. The road is made by walking. So you just have to let yourself be confident, but very self-reflective, and keep a watch on what you're doing with error correction. And with that, thank you very much.